They say they're my bank. They've confirmed my postcode and my account number. They say they've spotted suspicious activity on my account. They could be my bank. Now they've asked me to move my money to a safe account they've set up. That tells me they are not my bank. My money? My info? I don't think so.
A genuine bank will never contact you asking you to move your money to a safe account. Take 5.
Mike Graham, Talk Radio.
Let us say a very good morning to Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, how are you?
Morning. Glad I'm not a druid.
Well, indeed. I mean, there are many things that could make life worse at the moment, and I think being a druid's probably one of them.
You know, I don't admit to being a pessimist, by the way. I boast of being a pessimist. I've heard other people. If it's the one, I don't proselytize for most things. I'd say if you don't want to believe what I believe, then that's your affair. But honestly, you'd all be so much happier if you adopted pessimism. It is the key to happiness.
Yes. Are you then one of those that sees it all sort of sliding downhill from summer solstice day then?
Well, what do you say, downhill? I mean, I happen to like autumn, but no, it's obvious that the days start getting shorter and the nights longer. If you like that sort of thing, which I do, that's fine. So, no, it's not really like that at all. Pessimism is really accepting reality and not pretending to yourself that things are better than they are, or making up things to make yourself feel more cheerful. Pessimism is accepting the world as it is and living according to it. And also, I have to admit this, laughing at it quite a lot, though it's well known I have no sense of humour.
Yes, you see, I differ from you on that. I think you've got a great sense of humour. You just pretend not to have one, because I have
a certificate from the Bundeshumorlosigkeitsstiftung of Salzgitter in Germany to prove that I have no sense of humour. I'll get it out one of these weeks.
Is that a bit like the Cowardly Lion's courage medal that he got from The Wizard of Oz, though?
Something like that, yeah. But it's a good German certificate.
Listen, I'm all in favour of all sorts of ridiculous honours to be bestowed upon us for whatever it is that we do. Let's talk for a moment before we get into North Korea about the e-scooter story, because I noticed you've retweeted this incredible story about a guy trying to join a motorway stream on an e-scooter.
I've taken to tweeting pretty much every story I see about an e-scooter, because I get a lot of trouble from this. People say, well, why on earth are you going on about this trivial issue? I said, well, mainly because nobody else is. Right. And it's the job of journalists to draw attention to problems before they become generally accepted as problems. How do we get worked up about particular subjects? Why do these things become important? Because journalists pick them up and run with them. People say, well, what's it to do with you? The reason it's to do with me is I see this all the time, and I think that if we legalise these things, it will be an absolute madness. Someone tweeted me today from Singapore saying they've been banned there because they're too fast for the pavement and too unstable for the road, which I think is a very good summary of why it's completely daft to make them legal when they are already illegal. And there is an extremely smooth and well-financed lobby, which presumably hopes to make a lot of money out of selling them, working away at the moment. And at the moment, there are one or two people apart from me who seem to have spotted there's something wrong. We have a few months in which to prevent them being everywhere. And then you'll find once they're everywhere, you'll step out of a shop and one will whack into you. Yeah. Or worse, whack into a small child or an old lady with terrible consequences. Or you'll be driving on the road and one will swerve in front of you and you'll quite possibly smash into it through no fault of your own, because some idiot in the Transport Committee of the House of Commons decided to recommend that these things should be given a trial. I don't know why we ever needed this.
No. Well, this is all part, though, is it?
So transparently wrong.
Yeah, but it's all part, is it not, Peter, of this new green agenda? Anything which appears to take cars off the road, which is what they claim these will do, it has to be encouraged, regardless of how dangerous or otherwise it might be.
No evidence that they do that. I'm all in favour of there being fewer cars, but there's no evidence that e-scooters do this. People who drive cars are not going to swap them with their airbags and their seatbelts and their side impact protection, and indeed their protection from the weather, for a plank of metal, completely unprotected, with wholly inadequate brakes and safety measures, careering along the road. They're just not going to do it. The people who are going principally to ride e-scooters are going to be people who've lost their licenses, and people who can't be bothered to get licenses. People who have a proper motor car full licenses will not ride them. And the other thing is that why are they green? Batteries have to be charged.
Yes.
And this simple point needs to be made again and again. Where do you think the electricity comes from to charge the battery? Mostly in this country, either from imported power, quite a lot of which is coal burning, or from British generated power, quite a lot of which is these days generated by gas, which is supposed to be terribly clean and green, but it isn't. And it's a nonsense. Both the main arguments for them are crazy, and the safety arguments against them seem to me to be overpowering. And the idea that they will be effectively restricted to 12.5 miles an hour or whatever it is nonsense. You see from this incident on the M606 that they can get up to 70 miles an hour. And it just needs a certain amount of fiddling about with them. I don't know how to do it, but then I can't do really anything much on a computer. I promise you that plenty of scooter riders will learn very quickly, as indeed e-bike riders have learned to overcome the things which prevent.
But I mean, even with a basic lack of a basic knowledge of physics, you must be able to look at the size of the wheels on these scooters, the size of the human standing on it, and to know that travelling at that sort of speed, at 70 miles an hour on something with wheels that small, on what is probably a relatively uneven surface, is madness. It's idiotic.
No doubt, but speed is exhilarating, and people do stupid things, and what we have to do to prevent that is to make it harder for them to do them. And people say, well, why are you campaigning against cars? I say, well, I would campaign against cars, but they're already legal, and it's a simple fact. In all areas, from cars to drugs, something which has become legal and has been legal for many years cannot easily be banned. The same with motorbikes. And people say, well, why are you getting annoyed about bicycles on pavements? I say, okay, any time. But the truth is, these things already happen. Here we have a means of transport which is actually against the law, and which the government is proposing to make legal, and is allowing uniquely. I've never heard of this before at any point of the government saying, we're going to make something legal in specific areas which is illegal elsewhere in the country.
Yeah, it's absolutely extraordinary.
They do it with burglary, and so we're going to have an experiment there. We're going to make burglary legal. Of course, a lot of people will say, well, it appears to be legal already.
Well, it's certainly decriminalised.
It isn't actually legal. And why are they making something which is illegal everywhere else, legal in a few selected, punished cities, to get people used to something which they otherwise wouldn't be used to? I think people shouldn't get used to it. They should write to their members of parliament, going to writetothem.com, which tells you how. It's very easy, and say, look, I don't want these things, thank you very much. There's no need to make them legal. Please vote against any attempt to do so.
No, indeed. I mean, we'll be speaking later on to Nick Freeman, who's put a petition up to Parliament to try and get e-scooters and indeed bicycles actually registered and properly regulated so that people can be identified as the riders of said machines, whether it's a bike or whether it's an e-scooter. I mean, there's all kinds of arguments for and against it.
The only place I've ever seen bicycles with registration plates on them is actually North Korea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you pointed out, which takes us very nicely into our next segment, which was, as you described it, a woman who left North Korea and who's now effectively sort of a dissident from North Korea, who went to America to study and discovered that actually she felt that the people in educational establishments where she was studying were more supplicant, perhaps, than the people of North Korea.
Yeah, she was, I think, astonished, having gone to the huge efforts of bravery and suffering which are necessary to leave North Korea and get out, and winning what she thought was the huge honour of getting to Columbia University in New York City, which is one of the great universities of the United States. Yeah. She was horrified to find how willingly people accepted what was effectively brainwashing of the kind which her country underwent, because it was under a stern military dictatorship which had been imposed in wartime. We never, in the United States or Britain, had to undergo any such thing, yet we agree to be subjected to rules which say, if you say one thing out of turn about the sexual revolution or about transgender issues or whatever it happens to be, you can be cancelled. And even in the course of being taught about the great literature of the world, someone will tell you, oh, Jane Austen, she's really an advocate of slavery. You shouldn't be keen on that, and direct you to something else. This is the kind of dogmatic ideological education which used to take place only in dictatorships. She recognized it instantly. But what she also did, this is Yeonmi Park is her name, and she's written books about her experiences, but what she also did was she realized very quickly the protest against it was futile, that it was so established that the only thing to do to get the necessary grades and to get her degree was to pretend to go along with it. which is exactly what people do in countries like North Korea. You pretend to. Though I have to say, a fascinating thing about North Korea is that so many of the people I met genuinely believed what they'd been told and were actually quite upset if you suggested to them, for instance, that North Korea, the North had started the war, and they would become personally distressed if you told them. But that, that's not their fault. They live in a country where you can't read.
I was going to say,
or watch foreign television or listen to foreign radio. They didn't know.
Right. But this is the thing. I mean, as you point out, these are people who are only given one source of information, and they really have no choice but to accept that to be true. Whereas we don't have one source of information, albeit they try to cancel people who don't agree with them. There is still a reasonable plurality of ideas in this country.
Well, you'd say that, but in fact, it's increasingly symbolic and marginal. The major media only really give space to a very narrow set of views, and the recent events over COVID have intensified this. You simply can't get into the big newspapers or the major broadcasting channels if you don't have acceptable opinions. In many ways, it's actually rather like Vladimir Putin's Russia, where the major news channels are all totally in the hands of the sinister dictatorship. But there are small outlets are allowed to say practically anything you like. But as long as you carry on saying it in a magazine with a circulation of 15,000 or a radio station that nobody listens to, it doesn't matter. But as soon as you get anywhere near anything big, you'll be off air.
Yes.
And I think it's not imposed in the same way because, again, in Putin's Russia, people do it out of fear of the state. But in this country, people do it either because they genuinely believe in it, which many do, or out of fear of the process of cancellation by Twitter or whatever it happens to be. And the fear ultimately of losing your job, not the fear of imprisonment, the fear of losing your job and your livelihood, which is a very, very powerful fear. But as I keep saying, Amnesty International is never going to get up a letter writing campaign for someone who's lost his job. But as long as they don't imprison people for saying the wrong thing, the countries which are restricting free speech can get away with it forever.
And you've sort of dated all this back always, Peter, to the Blair regime, haven't you, when you came back from living abroad in Russia specifically?
The Blair regime intensified it and made it much more concrete, but it had been going on before. And the first time I really noticed it, I came back from, I'd been in Russia for 2.5 years, in America for 2 years. I came back in the late summer of 1995. And it was extraordinary how quickly I began to get this very strange feeling. Where does this country remind me of? It doesn't feel like Britain, the Britain I left in 1990 anymore at all. And it took a long time to acknowledge it because it was so crazy, as this North Korean young me Park must also have felt. But eventually I said to myself, this is actually terribly like the Soviet Union. There are so many things which bring, and this was before Blair. Okay, because the Cultural Revolution in broadcasting and publishing and the schools and the universities have been underway for years. What the Blair takeover did was they brought all these things into government and put the force of the law and Parliament behind them, and leading up to that amazing piece of legislation, terribly revolutionary, the Equality Act of 2010, which basically made what can loosely be called political correctness the official state belief and religion of the country.
And I suppose you might argue that those 2 years before Blair got in 97 were the kind of groundwork being laid for his accession to power. For example, things like Clive Hollick buying the Daily Express and turning it into a Labour-supporting newspaper.
Well, quite, yeah. And it was the groundwork was being laid. It was accepted by almost everybody in the Conservative Party that they were going to lose, and they couldn't, in many cases, see any great objection to it. I always was struck by the contrast between when Neil Kinnock lost his general election. He was genuinely furious, and he stood there saying, "Do not be old, do not be poor." He really, really hated the fact that he'd been beaten, and felt that it was a disaster for the country. And I thought that was to his credit, because what's the point of leading a political party if you don't believe what you say? John Major lost probably the most important election in modern British history and went off to the cricket.
Yeah. Well, he
likes your contrast. The Tory party at that time was completely flaccid. I remember the Tories go on and on now about Gordon Brown selling off all the gold reserves, which he did, an amazing act of folly. And they say this is a disaster, which it was. But at the time, I remember trying to get the Tory party to speak out against it, and the front bench couldn't be bothered. They just simply were not interested.
Yeah.
And fact, that was when I was a presenter on your radio station in its previous form.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get the go. The only person in Parliament who cared was a backbencher called Peter Tapsell, who spoke very eloquently against it. But the front bench could not be bothered. They were completely flaccid, supine.
Yes.
They totally accepted that that Labour had the sort of right to have won, and the Blairites had a right to have won.
Yeah, it was almost like it's their turn. Stay with us a moment. We're just going to take a short break. Peter, thank you very much indeed. We're going to talk a little bit more about the lockdown, Freedom Day, a bunch of other stuff. Peter Hitchens with us from the Mail on Sunday. We'll be back with Peter after
Mid-morning with Mike Graham. Talk Radio. The Independent Republic of Mike Graham on Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham. We're talking to Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday. Peter, let's finish up with a chat about what's going on inside Downing Street. We hear that Matt Hancock inadvertently or deliberately refused to pass information on to the Prime Minister about why we should not lift this lockdown on the grounds that they didn't think it was relevant enough or something. It seems as though we could have lifted everything today, but the July 19th date now is uncertain as well, isn't it?
Well, it's always uncertain until it happens. I think they are under very considerable political pressure to move on July 19th. The question is, how much of the restrictions will they keep? I strongly suspect, because they love it so much, that mask wearing will, for instance, be continued, perhaps indefinitely now. It's extraordinary, but the rest of it we'll see. And that's part of the reason for the hesitation, to make us feel that any relaxation is a gift to us rather than a return to what our normal lives ought to be.
Yeah.
Also, the whole thing is a result of this complete surrender by political leadership, which is supposed to speak for the country and to assess things on rational grounds, and the scientific advisors who have only one interest in their lives, and that is not to be wrong. And therefore they cannot ever advise that we should open up, because to do that, this is the one thing. If they get that wrong, then their whole purpose in life will have been destroyed. They will look crazy. If they get it right, they'll get no credit for it. You can never expect the scientific advisors to advise that we should open up, and the government's ministers really ought to understand this and understand that it's their responsibility to take these decisions. Obviously, from my point of view, I don't think the thing should ever have been imposed. It remains to me as mad as burning down your house to get rid of a wasp nest. But trying to see it purely for the sake of argument from inside the government, they have to understand that politicians are responsible to Parliament and then to the country. And they have wider responsibilities and indeed wider bases on which to take decisions than their scientific advisors, who simply cannot be allowed to take decisions for them. Otherwise, what is the point in having a government at all? We might as well just hand the country over to experts who will always take the cautious line. We will never be able to travel properly again. We will be under constant surveillance. Everything we do will be checked. Our children will wear masks in kindergarten. We won't be able to see old people when they get ill. The whole of life will be constrained because of what experts of this kind see is an objective of total safety, zero COVID, zero disease, zero danger, of everything being wrapped in cotton wool. Well, you might be safe in the middle of that, but you wouldn't really be human anymore.
Well, that's right. And safety has many descriptions, and safety may not apply to every single aspect of all of that. I watched an interview with Rory Stewart over the weekend that he gave sort of back in March of last year, which was quite interesting, in which he basically said what lessons he had learned from various sort of problems that he'd had to sort out in his political career, including Ebola, was that it's all very well listening to experts, but you have to listen to the experts in the area in which they are expert, rather than allowing them to become experts in everything.
Well, you also have to recognise that experts differ. And what this government has done from the start is it's taken advice on this from a certain group of experts who've taken one view, and it's ignored other experts who've taken a different view. And I think that when perhaps 20 or 30 years from now it's cooled down enough for there to be a dispassionate analysis of what happened, one of the things that we recognise is that we made a grave mistake in not listening to some of the experts who said that the measures proposed were excessive. And also they were kept going for far too long. But the problem is now so many people have a stake in believing in this. The people who fell for it, of course, they themselves don't want to admit that they were fooled. So they're all in the if only the government had locked down earlier camp. And then the government themselves, they cannot conceivably say we've bankrupted the country 5 times over for a mistake. So they have to insist that what they did was right. But there will come a time when all the people, all the individuals involved are out of politics and out of the scientific rat race, and it will then be possible to analyse it properly. And truth is the daughter of time. I'm quite confident that sometime after I'm dead, somebody will pop up and say, well, actually, yes, it was all a great mistake, but it's no good now. We're stuck with the fact that huge numbers of people have a stake in it. The only way to bring this to an end, or at least to bring it down to manageable, bearable levels, is to keep on pointing out to the cabinet that they were elected to govern the country, and they have wider responsibilities than those that the zero COVID merchants would like to impose on.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Good point to end on. Peter, thank you very much indeed. We'll see you next week. Peter Hitchens, Man on Sunday columnist there, making a great deal of common sense, as he always does. There's